And welcome everyone to today's Synergist Town Hall webinar, Answer Your Top FRCP Questions. I'm Ed Rakowski, Editor-in-Chief of the Synergist, the magazine of the American Industrial Hygiene Association. I'd like to thank all of our attendees for participating today, and especially Bulwark for sponsoring today's webinar. Today's presentation was built directly from questions submitted by users of flame-resistant and chemical splash-resistant clothing. Even though the webinar will be presented in a question and answer format, don't worry, we will still reserve time at the end of the hour for any new questions our audience may have. Our presenter today is Mark Sainer, the FR Technical Manager for Bulwark. He has more than 35 years of experience in the fire and safety industry, including 29 years in technical support, safety standards, and product development for the Akron Brass Manufacturing Company. Mark participates in a number of NFPA and ASTM standards committees related to flame-resistant fabric and clothing requirements and performance testing. Now I'll turn the presentation over to Mark.
Thanks, Ed. Appreciate everybody joining us today. Before we get started, just want to make a little note that, Bulwark Protected Brands is not responsible, obviously, for conducting the hazard assessments for your individual companies. That would be your responsibility, and determining whether or not the clothing or other gear that you might provide your employees is suitable for that particular application. So with that said, let's get started. The town hall we're going to be talking about today, as Ed said, revolves around questions that we got regarding the FRCP lab coats and coveralls that were presented in a previous webinar presentation. So for those who maybe didn't see that presentation or don't remember all the details of it, just a couple of definitions to be clear. FRCP, we're talking about clothing and fabric that are flame resistant and chemical protective. And by flame resistant, we mean they either self-extinguish, don't melt, don't drip, don't add to the injury of the wearer. And for chemical protection, we're talking about the ability of the fabric the garment's made of to repel small amounts of inadvertent liquid chemical splashes at atmospheric pressure. So with that said, let's jump into some of the questions that have come up either during or before the presentation. So one of the questions that gets asked is, how often do I need to provide PPE training for each of my employees? Well, that's a question that there really isn't a specified time frame listed anywhere in particular for PPE training. Obviously, when you get a new employee, you'd want to have them trained on the proper use of the PPE, or when any of the employees are going to be exposed to a new exposure that they're not familiar with or haven't been trained for. Any retraining would have to be determined based on the employer's guidelines and rules that they may have set up for their particular organization, their particular hazards. We also get asked a question about, will the the FRCP lab coats eventually be a requirement for all laboratories in sometime in the future? And to that I would say anybody that's working with flammable chemicals or even open flames, you've got the potential for clothing ignition. And if this hazard is present, then definitely an FR lab coat would be needed. Even if it's pyrophoric chemicals that you're working with that could have auto ignition, then FR would be the right kind of product to have. And we've seen a number of labs move in that direction, so hopefully that will continue. In addition, most labs have some hazardous chemicals that their employees might be exposed to. And, there should be some kind of protection. So it would be logical that at some point in time that the FRCP dual hazard combination lab coat would be a good solution for that particular application. Next one we get is understand that all employees must do or employers must do a hazard assessment, but are there any rules of thumb that labs have? Things like workers working with more than a certain amount. 1 liter, for example, of flammable solvents should wear the FRCP lab coats. Well, again, rule of thumb, a little tough to come up with. Each individual lab would need to determine, the amount and the risk that would be involved with that use. But as an example, in my conversations with the University of California system, they use 1 liter of flammable solvents as their threshold for when they think FR protection is needed. So, that's kind of a threshold, a rule of thumb that's used by one institution, but again, that's something that you would want to individually look at the amounts that you're handling, look at the risk potential for any exposure it might have. So it gives you a little bit of an idea on that. Are the FRCP lab coats arc resistant? By arc resistant, we're talking about electrical arc flash. They are obviously suited for a flame fire type exposure. That's why they're FR, but arc flash is a different type of hazard. So the FRCP lab coats, they do in fact have an arc rating, but it's only 5.6 cal per square centimeter, so it's not very high. And that's because it's made of a lightweight Nomex base fabric. And that fabric is the fabric used on purpose. Number one, if you're going to be wearing it all day long, lightweight, comfortable, breathable, which the Nomex 3A base fabric is a plus. So you want to have that capability. It was designed basically for flash fire and inadvertent chemical splash. Those are the primary hazards it's designed for in the laboratory setting. So although it has that low arc rating, that's really not the main hazard that we're trying to protect against. So it has one, but not very high. So why do the lab coats have to be blue in color? Because they are royal blue, the FRCP lab coats are. Well, one of the reasons is that it does make it identifiably different from the other common lab coats, which typically are white color. So when you see one of the workers in that royal blue lab coat, you know it's something different than what everybody else is wearing. And royal blue is a common lab coat color for FR. The difference between the FRCP and just a standard FR, one of the differences visually is the collar. The FRCP has a black collar as well as a unique logo with the FRCP on it. So again, that differentiates it from the other flame-resistant royal blue lab coats that might be out there, because they're commonly used in different industries and different academic settings. There is a new development, and that's the CP lab coat, which does come in white, so it's different than the royal blue. But again, it's different because it does not have the FR properties. The royal blue one with the black collar is the FRCP version. The white one would be the CP only, just the chemical protective properties. And the royal blue without the black collar, just royal blue collar, would be FR only. So we wanted to have some way to visually differentiate between those, so you could, at a quick glance, see who's wearing what type of protection. So that was kind of the idea behind that. What PPE should be used when working with polar organic solvents? Well, obviously the FRCP lab coat would fit into that, but what other kinds of PPE? Well, most of the lab managers talk to us about things like eye protection. So you've got safety goggles, safety glasses, protective gloves, keep your hands protected, lab coats obviously, and additional protection in some cases might be needed. So you might need to wear face shields, you might wear breathing equipment. There are fume hoods, glove boxes, benchtop shields, those kinds of things. And depending on what the chemicals that you're working with, it might even be full barrier suits would be warranted to be worn. In addition to those types of things in the lab environment, you want to ensure that you've got fire extinguishers, safety showers, you want to have eye wash fountains, first aid kits, fire blankets, all those kinds of safety gear should be available and easily accessible to the employees. So if there is an exposure, they can get to a shower wash station, or they can get to the eye wash out quickly, or if there's some other kind of an accident where they've got some cuts or injuries, you want to have the first aid kit. So it kind of depends on the situation, but definitely eye protection, hand protection, and the body protection with the lab coats would be absolutely necessary, and then the other things depending on your particular situation. Can FR resist chemical spills, at least to some degree? So if you're wearing just an FR only, which they've been around for a long time, and so there may be a number of laboratory or other settings where you've got an FR only lab coat. You know, do they provide any spill protection? Well, not really. Most of the standard FR fabrics are typically designed so they have some ability to wick moisture, and that's for, you know, overheating. They want to be able to wick some sweat off the body, and that's common for FR fabrics. So obviously, any kind of a liquid spill is going to absorb right in with that wicking, either wicking finish or wicking fibers are in there. They're typically, as I mentioned earlier, air permeable. You want to have some airflow to keep the person wearing the coat cool. A lot of them are worn in outdoor applications. So, you know, the fabric itself is very breathable, which, again, would allow liquid chemicals to penetrate. And, you know, some of the FR fibers, like Nomex itself, are very resistant to degrading from exposure. If they get exposed to an acid or a corrosive of some sort, they don't degrade very quickly. They don't repel, really. You know, they're going to allow the liquid to penetrate through. So even though it's FR, that's not a good solution for chemical spill splash protection. Can repairs be made to the FRCP? The answer is yes, absolutely. They can be made. You know, they have to be reasonable, and they have to be made using the same materials. So you don't want to repair an FRCP lab coat with some other kind of fabric. You don't want to take an area that might have a tear or a hole in it and repair it with a different fabric, because that obviously isn't going to have the same properties. And if it's, you know, if they're very large or they're extensive tears or damage, then you really need to replace them at that point. You don't want your workers out there working in clothing that's got the potential for penetration through holes or tears or those types of things. So they can be repaired, but within limits. Has to be reasonable, and again, you have to use the same types of fabrics and components that were used in the original. Next, and I get asked this question a lot, not only with lab coats but other FRs, are they suitable for anti-static, working with things like gassing of aerosols? And, you know, the answer to that is no, not really. You need a specialized lab coat when that potential situation, that hazard exists. And you may even need other things like grounding devices. And it all depends on the severity of it. But, you know, you would notice in the FRCP lab coats, in the label, and it actually lists 2% anti-static. But that's not for a static-free environment. That's just a little bit of a nuisance static clean situation. So although they have that little bit of anti-stat in it, it's not for a static-free environment. If you've got static issues, that's a potential hazard that, you know, static could ignite some type of a gas, then you really need something that's uniquely designed for that application for the anti-static. And or you also might need some other grounding devices to assist in trying to protect your employees from that particular situation. You know, it's a pretty unique hazard, and unfortunately, that the government doesn't have that capabilities at this point in time to provide relief for that. So, your environment, anti-static is a requirement. Static is a requirement, and you're going to need to take some additional steps to make sure that the employees protected from that particular hazard. What happens if the lab coat's FRCP lab coat gets wet? interesting question. Obviously the coat is launderable, so getting wet with water in and of itself isn't an issue because it has, as I said, can be laundered. But if it's exposed, to a splash with water, typically the water would repel right off. But if there's a large amount of it or it's under pressure, if you got a water line that breaks and it sprays you with it under pressure, the fabric can in fact get wet to some degree, and that being wet then would allow it to chemicals to penetrate through. Its repellent properties would be diminished quite a bit. So once it gets wet, if it does, if it's, for example, if you have some water, a pool of water on a lab table top, and you lean on it, you're going to push that water through the fabric. But again, if it adds pressure when it does its repelling. If it's under pressure, you can push it into the fabric. Now, that area is already wet, so it's going to allow other liquids to penetrate much more easily. So you want to, if it gets wet, you're going to want to take it off, replace it with a dry one until that one dries out itself. So seems logical, but most times it's not an issue because it's going to repel right off. But you do need to be aware if it can get wet. You can force it to get wet if the situation's right. How do I wash a pathogen exposed lab coat? And they specifically asked about bleaching because that would be a typical way to deal with pathogens. This coat is not designed for pathogen exposure. That's a whole different animal. It has different rules, different situations you need. As I said in the very beginning, repels inadvertent liquid chemical splash at atmospheric pressure. Not to mention that bleach and FR don't go together. If you read any laundry labels, any labeling on FR garments, it's going to say do not bleach. Depending on what the fabric is, it can have a very negative effect on the long-term performance, FR performance of the garment, and even the chemical repellency. So, it would depend on the amount, the concentration, how it's applied, etc. And since that's oftentimes out of your control, exposure to bleach is not a good idea. So once it is exposed, should be removed, particularly when it's got a pathogen on it. It should be removed, quarantined, and take some specialized pathogen cleanup removal type situation. So you need somebody that knows how to deal with the pathogens to solve that problem. So not designed for that application. Inadvertent liquid chemical splash of acids, corrosives, those types of typical chemical exposures you might see in a laboratory environment. Are the knit cuffs both FR and CP? On the lab coats, you'll see it has a black knit cuff, and that's on there for a couple specific reasons. One is so that when you're reaching across the table or the bench top, you don't have an open cuff hanging there that might catch on something and knock it over. It also helps protect from allowing particulate to go down inside the sleeve of the coat. But no, it is not CP. It is FR, but it's not CP. It's flame-resistant knit material, so it won't ignite. But because it's a stretchy knit fabric, as you stretch it out, it can open up the gaps between yarns, and it can allow liquid chemicals to penetrate. So, should be wearing the appropriate protective gloves either under or over the top. As I said in an earlier slide, gloves is one of the protective pieces of PPE that should be worn when you're working with hazardous chemicals, whatever the proper rating of the glove might be. And that should then, as I said, be worn either under or over the cuff. So it's flame resistant, but it's not chemical protective. Is the coat washable without harming the properties? I think I mentioned earlier that yes, it is washable. So, and the flame-resistant properties cannot be washed away as long as you follow the laundry instructions. It's made of inherently flame-resistant fibers, Nomex, Kevlar. and so it can be washed without any effect on the flame-resistant properties as long as you follow the instructions. And the chemical repellency, it does have somewhat of a limitation. We guarantee it up to 50 industrial launderings, which is at fairly high temperatures and heavy soil chemicals at times. And that property, the repellence properties, can start to diminish over time. There has been testing done by some laundries up to 100 launderings, and it still had its repellency properties intact. And washing it in lower temperatures also helps to extend its life beyond 50. But there are limitations. Now, what we've found in talking with users in the lab community, these don't get washed very often. Even if they're in a laundry program, they don't get turned in very often. I hear people tell me that their lab coats maybe get washed, 2, 3, 4, 5 times a year at most. So it's not very frequent. And if you say you go to 5 times a year, guaranteed up to 50, that's 10 years of use. So laundry is not a problem. You just have to, follow the rules, read the laundry instructions. Lower temperatures is better, but it's guaranteed up to 50 industrial launderings. I often get asked about acetone because that's on the list of the chemicals that it does not repel. There's nonpolar organic solvents that it doesn't work well with. It works well with polars, but not nonpolars. And my response to that typically is, yeah, you're right, it doesn't repel acetone, but standard white 6535 cotton poly lab coat, it doesn't repel acetone either. But that 6535, it doesn't repel any chemicals, acids, corrosives, it doesn't do anything. And, skin contact with acetone is really not a particularly dangerous situation. It's a fingernail polish remover, so it isn't going to really damage your skin with some small exposure to acetone. Now, granted, I know it could be a carrier for other things which are bad, so you do need to be careful. So when you're working around the non-polar solvents, you may need some additional splash protection other than just wearing the FRCP. But that's no different than if you were wearing a standard lab coat. If you're going to work around non-polars and you're working with a standard lab coat, you typically would want to put on some other kind of splash protection, some non-permeable protection, whether it be a disposable or an apron or some other kind of non-permeable chemical protective garment. The downside of the chemical protective ones, the non-permeables, they're not very comfortable. So one of the things that we talk about is, and it falls into that last slide, when you have secondary protection, when you have a second layer of protection that you need, that can cause its own problems. Number one is when it's time to work with that chemical that you need that special protection for, if it's an acid or corrosive in this situation, that wearer has got to make a decision. Do I need to put that on? Where is it? How long is it going to take me to get to it? And will they make a good decision? Will they will they make the decision, yeah, I'm working with an acid that's pretty bad stuff, whether it's, sulfuric acid or hydrofluoric acid or whatever it might be. I've got to make a decision to go get that extra layer of protection. And we know what employees do in a lot of cases. They think about it and say, I've done this a million times, no big deal. I'm just going to take transfer a little bit of that from point A to point B, whether it be an acid, a pyrophoric, whatever it might be. I'm just going to transfer it over, no big deal. Well, that's when accidents happen, and that's getting rid of that decision point. If you've got that FRCP lab coat on, you don't have to worry about deciding what do I need to wear and where is it, and go find it to put it on. It takes that decision point out of the equation. Because the other thing we find is, in that same vein, is oftentimes those extra layers are unused. The workers just don't take the time or the energy or remember to go wear them. Not to mention the fact they can be bulky, they can be uncomfortable, because typically they're not breathable. And so, they're going to be hot, they can be bulky, restrict your movement, not a great thing. And that's another reason why employees decide not to wear them sometimes, because they don't like them. And not to mention, they may not be FR. A lot of them, and maybe the majority of them, are not flame resistant. So if you're working with take a pyrophoric, for example, and you put this extra layer on because you're wearing it for some other protection, and you get a flame exposure, they're going to ignite. So it gives you some problems there. It's not a good idea. So there's a number of reasons why having a dual hazard product that's comfortable, lightweight, breathable, recognizable what it is, that they can wear as daily wear all day long, is a good idea. It gives you that better assurance that they're going to be more protected than if they were just wearing their standard 65-35 white polycotton lab coat. So those are some things to think about. So that was the list of questions that came up after the original presentations. So Ed, do we have any additional questions that have come in so far?
Mark, we do have a handful waiting for us, but before we do that, there was a little bit of trouble with your audio that made the presentation of one of your slides, I think, a little hard for our attendees to hear. Would you mind going back and presenting slide 12 one more time?
That slide there? The anti-static?
I think that's the one. Yes.
Okay, sure, no problem. Sorry about that. I don't know if it was on my end, or I'll blame it on you, Ed. Couldn't be my end.
Okay, I'll take the blame.
Okay. So the question had to do with, are the lab coats suitable for anti-static environments where you might be working with, things like gassing of aerosols? So, and the answer to that is no. They're really not designed for static-free environments. If you're going to be working in an environment where static is a potential problem, you're going to need a specialized garment, and or you may even need some additional protection, grounding devices, things to eliminate or reduce the potential for static. You'll see in these garments they do have a small percentage of anti-static fibers in them, but that's not designed for a static-free environment. That's designed just to minimize the amount of nuisance static cling kind of a thing. So although there is a little bit of anti-static fiber in them, it's really not designed for a static-free environment. That environment's going to need something special, either a static-free garment, or it's going to need, and it may be in addition to, it may also need grounding devices to help minimize the potential for a static exposure. Did you hear that one okay?
We did. Thanks so much, Mark. It looks like we have a fair amount of time for questions. We've got a handful already waiting. Just a reminder to our audience that if you'd like to ask a question, please type it into the chat box on the bottom right of your window of your screen. If you don't see the window, you might have to move your mouse down towards the bottom of your screen, and then you'll notice a chat bubble icon pop up. And then you'll be able to chat your questions to host or to all panelists. So let's get to our first question here. Veronica has a question about reference material. She says that in many organizations, supervisors often make the selection for laboratory coats. So it's useful to have some easy-to-understand references to share with those people who are selecting the coats. Is there any handy material that you know of, Mark, that's freely available that can be referenced as authoritative and shared with employees for educational purposes?
Well, we there is a technical brief that has been written by us that talks about lab hazards, and it talks about how protection against certain types of hazards, whether it be the flame type hazards or the chemical splash type hazards, and it lists a number of the common chemicals that can be used, including the list of the ones that the FRCP fabric repels. So it gives you some insights on what it can and can't do, because there are limitations to it. As I mentioned, the non-polar organic type solvents, it doesn't really repel those, but it gives a list of a number of others and basic categories, including different acids, polar organic solvents, those types of things. So that would probably be the best resource, I would think, that they could use to use as a guide to compare to their hazard assessment and see what might be most suitable for their application. And that is on the website, and or if somebody can't figure out how to get it from the website, they can certainly contact me directly via email, and I'd be happy to forward on that technical brief on the FRCP stuff.
Great, thanks, Mark. We have a few questions from Rachel about organophosphate pesticide applications, and I think I'll just read them. I'll do them one at a time. Her first question is, what type of protective clothing should be worn when watering plants that have been treated with organic phosphate pesticides?
Well, that's a new one on me. Haven't gotten that one before. Read that back one more time.
Sure. She asks, what type of protective clothing should be worn when watering plants that have been treated with organic phosphate pesticides?
Well, I don't know that I can answer that one right here and now. I'm going to have to research that a bit. My guess would be that it's, this kind of a product would work fine because it's a aqueous solution that's being used, and so most aqueous solutions work. The FRCP product works very well with. But why don't you send me that information, Ed, and then I'll try and answer that one offline, because I don't want to give a bad answer. I want to research it a little bit, talk to my chemical experts at the fabric manufacturer, and make sure that we've got a solid answer for her.
Sure, fair enough, Mark. I'll send you her other two questions as well, as they're around about the same topic. So you can get back with her once you've had a chance.
Yeah, and I would mention that we have a list of the chemicals that it's been tested. The fabric's been tested to. Obviously, it's not every liquid chemical out there, because that would take forever. But we do occasionally get requests for will it work with, fill in the blank, and we're very capable of working with our supplier of the fabrics for them to do some additional testing and verify if that particular chemical should be suitable for the product. So we do have that capability. So even though we have a list, obviously it doesn't cover everything, and if you have something outside that list, we can certainly check it and let you know if it's suitable for that application.
Great. Veronica says one issue that's come up in her previous work regards cleaning recommendations. She says, in the past, I have had a hard time finding clear guidelines for the number of washes a garment can take. Is there any new information on this?
Well, as I think I said in one of my slides, the FR base fabric is, you cannot wash the FR properties out of it. It's inherent in the fibers, and so, you can wash it in hot temperatures, fairly heavy chemicals, and it's really not going to affect the FR properties. Now, in terms of the chemical repellency properties, we've set a limitation of 50 industrial launderings. Now, when we talk industrial launderings, we're talking about fairly high temperatures, higher than you would have in a typical laundry application. So they're in the 140, 150 degree type water temperatures, and they would oftentimes use heavier chemicals. But the FR properties, aren't something that can be washed out of them. We do say, as I mentioned earlier, also, you're not supposed to use bleach or hydrogen peroxide on them. Standard laundry detergents, work fine, and the FR properties will last through those launderings for the life of the garment. They're going to wear out before they wash out. The chemical repellency, on the other hand, is guaranteed to 50, although we've seen at lower temperatures it approach 100 launderings and still have its chemical repellency. And I would add that when that chemical repellency reaches its, I'll say, limits with quotations around it, it doesn't just go from it repels to it doesn't repel. It starts to diminish its ability over time. So, at 51 launderings, it doesn't mean it's no longer chemical repellent. It's just some of the chemicals it doesn't repel as well as it used to. Some chemicals it'll repel up to 100 launderings, not a problem, but not all of them. And so we had to set a limit someplace, and so 50 industrial is what we set that limitation to.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Melissa asks, she has a room at her facility where a powdered hazardous chemical is being used. Workers are required to wear coveralls to prevent skin contact with that chemical, but they also occasionally do arc flash work. So they need protection from both that chemical and the arc flash. What would you suggest? They would have on arc flash clothing underneath, but would an FR coverall provide sufficient protection from the powdered hazardous chemical?
Well, it is air permeable, so it's not airtight. So it's designed for liquid protection, not solid. So, it would have limited ability, and not knowing whatever the powder is, not sure how it would react to it. But it's not designed for powder; it's designed for liquid. It's got some minimal ability, but I would hesitate to say that it would be the right choice for a solid, because that's not what it's designed for. It is, as I said, it's air permeable, so you can see through it. It'll go through it. Just liquids won't go through it. So a fine dust potentially could go through. So that would be problematic, I would think. In that case, most of the people that are working around dust that they don't want to get on them use some other type of oftentimes a disposable type garment, but you would want it to be an FR disposable. Because you don't want it to be potentially ignite. If you put on a regular disposable that's for, dust protection, it's probably flammable. So if you've got any kind of a ignition situation potentially, then that thing's going to light up, very easily. So that wouldn't be a good choice. But there are disposables that are flame resistant, so that would be a potential for that. It's getting a little dicey because are there liquids also, liquid chemicals? Are there, is it flammable? Is it dust? So that's starting to get a little, lot of different hazards trying to get into one garment. So that makes it a little tricky. Again, there may be some options, but the FRCP really, it'll keep some particulate off, but depends on how fine it is. Because as I said, it is permeable, so air can go through it. So fine dust can go through it, and it depends on, is the dust under pressure or is it just floating around? There's lots of variables involved in that, and dust is not what it was designed for.
Okay. Robert asks, are there any clean room approved FR personal protective equipment? And if there are, do these items have the same lifespan as non-clean room approved FR apparel?
Well, we at Bulwark don't have any clean room type application or products in our line per se. We have two disposable coveralls, again, that are flame resistant, and one has a little bit of chemical repellency properties to it. But I don't think they aren't rated as clean room. There may be some things out there. I would suggest that perhaps they look at, I know DuPont makes some disposable chemical, probably they might even have some clean room application products, but it's not something that my company has in our line of offering.
Okay. Veronica says, I've read about treatments on garments as a concern to some people. Do you have any information about sensitivity, individual sensitivity to the treatments of the garments?
Well, I'll answer in two ways because I'm not sure exactly what she's talking about, but I know I have people that have asked about FR treatment on typically they're a cotton or a cotton blend type fabrics. In order to make those flame resistant, it has to go through an FR treatment process. And there have been, on a very rare occasions, people that have some skin sensitivity to that particular chemistry that's used for that. It's very rare. I mean, we got hundreds of people sewing garments that are handling them all day long and don't have issues with them, and there's millions of them out in the workplace that people don't typically have skin sensitivity problems with. But with that said, with the treated products, there can be some small amount of formaldehyde in the chemistry. It washes down pretty quickly, and it's below the limits where that are set by the government, where your exposures well below the exposure limits, and so it's typically not a problem. Other sensitivities, we've not heard of any with the FRCP lab coat chemistry on it, but typically that's worn over something else. Could have your arms exposed. You may be wearing a short sleeve top underneath of it. We have not run into any issues with skin sensitivity to that product. The only thing I've heard of in my tenure in the FR business is the rare occasion when somebody has skin sensitivity to the treated cotton or cotton blend fabrics, but it's extremely rare. And oftentimes what we'll find is it's really not the FR fabric itself, it's whatever they washed it in or exposed it to, but they didn't know about causing the sensitivity. So hopefully that answered her question.
Great, thanks, Mark. Another question is asking, do you have a list of chemicals that the FRCP lab coat works for?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I alluded to it earlier in our technical brief. There's a list of a whole variety of them, and we've actually tested some additional ones since this list has been published. But they're broken down by corrosive liquids like sulfuric acid, hydrochloric, hydrofluoric, nitric acid, hydrogen peroxide, and then there's a list of polar organic solvents, including things like acetonitrile, DMSO, nitrobenzene, methanol, ethanol. So there is a list in that technical brief, which can be found on the website, or I can provide if somebody shoots me an email that comes to me. I can also provide that. So yeah, there is a list, and the kind of the guideline that we use is if it's medium to high surface tension, medium to high polarity, then it's typically going to work. We do oftentimes we'll send out a swatch sample of fabric. You can test it yourself, see if it works. And again, that inadvertent splash at atmospheric pressure. So it does not work under pressure. But if somebody wants a list, they can check on the website. They can also shoot me an email. Did we publish my email on the webinar? I don't know that we did necessarily.
That's a good question, Mark. I'm not sure, but we can make it available with your slides, perhaps, when they're available tomorrow.
Yeah, and that would be fine. And I can, if somebody wants to write real quick, I'll just read it off. It's mark_sainer@vfc.com. That's Mark, M-A-R-K, _ and my last name Sainer, S as in Sam, A-N-E-R, at VFC, VictorFrankCharlie.com.
Great, thanks, Mark. Another question, how does the cost of the FRCP lab coat compare to a typical lab coat?
Well, I don't think anybody'd be surprised. They're more expensive. So typically you're looking at anywheres in the neighborhood. We don't sell them directly. We sell them through distributors. So, I don't know exactly what price the different distributors might sell them for, but they're probably going to be in the $150, $175 range would be my guess for the FRCP versus a typical lab coat might cost, $40, something like that. So they're quite a bit more expensive, but keep in mind, it's a dual hazard, and the current lab coat is no hazard. Protection whatsoever. They last an extremely long period of time, so you get your money out of them. If you're buying separate garments to go over top of them, particularly disposables, you can go through those pretty quickly, and they get expensive if you go through a lot of them. So, you look at the total value of the use and the protection value that you might have, kind of offset some of that cost. I know that the University of California, when they switched over to FR lab coats, they actually even got, I think they got a little break on their insurance because they were having more protection for their employees. But yeah, it's quite a bit more expensive. Now the CP lab coat isn't as much. It's more in the $75, $80 range. So it's about half of the FRCP. To get just that chemical protection only, not the FR. So going to run, the CP's in the $75, $80 range, and the FRCP is going to be in the $150 to $175 range, depending on how the distributors mark them up.
Okay. One word, Mark, do the lab coats come in different sizes, and is there a men's and women's style?
It's a good question. Yes, they do come a whole variety of different sizes, all the way from extra small up to, larger sizes. And it does specifically come in women's styling, women's cut, and we did that purposely because we know there's a lot of female in the laboratory industry, lab workers. So we wanted to make sure that they had a garment that was well suited for their particular physique. So yes, they come both men's and women. That's in the FRCP. I just looked, and it's the men's come extra small. Well, the women's too, extra small up to 5X. So a whole range, both men's and women's. The CP coat comes in a variety of sizes, but there is not a women's cut in that particular style. So the white CP only coat. At least not at this point in time. So comes in a variety of sizes, and as I said, the FRCP also comes in a women's cut.
Okay, thanks. Mark, we had a question from one of our attendees asking you to, if you could repeat the link to the technical brief you were referring to earlier. I think this attendee is referring to the where they can find the materials that you were talking about when we started the Q&A, the free resources. So I believe, and this is going to be a little, well, I don't want to say tricky is the right word, but most of your
our participants today probably aren't going to know this, but the original FRCP lab coat was made by a company by the name of Workrite. Workrite Uniform, that's Workrite. And Workrite Uniform Company was acquired by the parent company that owns Bulwark, and so now we've integrated together. We're one and the same. I don't believe all the website systems have been integrated yet, so in order to find the FRCP lab coat technical brief, I would recommend to go on the workrite.com website. That's WORKRITE.com, and in there you can look down, find one of the drop boxes that takes you to the FRCP lab coats, and in there there's videos, there's the technical brief, some other information that might be available. I don't believe it's up on the Bulwark website as of yet. The other option is to shoot me the email at mark_sainer@bfc.com.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Regina has... sorry.
I was just saying, I hope that wasn't too complicated. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, post my email. That'll be good.
Yeah, Regina's chatted it out to all of our participants, so they can reach you if they need to. And we have run out of questions, so we'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar. My thanks to Mark Sanford for his presentation, to Bulwark for sponsoring today's webinar, and to all of our participants. Please keep an eye on aiha.webvent.tv for future Synergist webinars, and have a great rest of your day.
All right. Thank you, everyone. This actually concludes today's webcast. Thank you all for attending. The recording will be available at aiha.webvent.tv. We will send all registrants an email tomorrow with this link. And please visit our event calendar to sign up for future webcasts.